Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. For today's video, I want to talk about the Human Centipede movies, specifically just the first and second one. For those of you who are not aware, there are 3 parts to the Human Centipede trilogy. And they're kind of gross movies. The first movie came out in 2009, and all 3 are written and directed by Tom Six. He is a Dutch horror director and writer, and Tom Six came up with the idea for the Human Centipede after joking with one of his friends that a child molester that was arrested should be forced to have his mouth sewn to the butt of a fat truck driver, just like as his punishment. And the more Tom thought about this, the more he thought that'd be a great horror movie. So he started looking into the logistics of doing like a human centipede type creature. He did even speak to actual doctors. The one doctor he did consult at first refused to help with this movie because he thought it was just such a sick idea, but he did sort of give him a little bit more of the logistics of what it would take to create a human centipede, which Tom used in his movies. The first Human Centipede movie is dubbed as being medically accurate, which is kind of true. It's a surgery that technically could be done, but how it's done in the movie is just not how it would realistically go about, and then like the nutritional value and the infections that would happen after the surgery. We'll get there. Well, recently I was watching another video on YouTube talking about a bunch of just like super disturbing, some of the most disturbing movies out there, and a lot of them resulted around body horror, which is basically just any type of horror movie or thing that results in a deformity or mutilation of the human body. You know, examples of body horror being movies like The Thing, pretty much anything made by David Cronenberg, movies like The Blob, that basically result in the human body being so deformed to the point where it's no longer human. There are tons of movies out there that you can watch that have sort of this like body horror aspect to them. Even movies like The Hills Have Eyes is considered body horror because of the deformities of the families within that movie. So stuff like that, but this was considered like a huge break for body horror because it was so disturbing and disgusting, especially to be considered a mainstream movie, because a lot of the deeper, grosser, more disturbing body horror movies are the kind of movies that you're not going to find on streaming services, and you have to like really dig to find. This was one that was sort of like, it was released in theaters, it had sort like a DVD release, it had people who backed behind it. It was a popular movie that was widely disliked. And in the video I was watching about body horror movies, they talked about the Human Centipede 2, which when I watched the Human Centipede 1, I watched the second one back to back. All 3 movies are supposed to be watched in sequence, and they're almost like a movie centipede in the sense of each movie relates to the other one, but not directly. And what I mean by that is the first movie happens, and then the second movie is about a real-life person who watches the first movie, becomes obsessed, and tries to do it themselves. And then the third movie stars the same characters from the first and second movie as all new characters, but they also acknowledge the fact that the first and second movies exist, and they then mimic what happens in those movies in the third movie. So it is one long story, but it's not like a story that's going to have the same characters and you're just seeing them fighting on and on. It's the same people, the same idea, but different settings, different plots that just sort of bounce and feed off of the previous movies. In the first Human Centipede, while it's definitely still regarded as a disgusting, horribly awful, you shouldn't watch it movie, the second one is worse. The second one makes the first one look a lot shinier and better than it really is. And that's mainly because of the gritty disgustingness of the second movie. And across the board, out of the 3, the second movie is the most disturbing. It was banned in certain countries. It didn't have a theatrical release in the US. It was only shown in like festivals and stuff like that. And a lot of it just seemed over the top. It received a ton of negative reviews because it seemed like a sort of cash grab piggybacking off of the first movie and just being as gross and disgusting as possible. And Tom Six did admit that when he came up with the first idea, he had the idea of making a trilogy Human Centipede and doing it just how he had done it. And he primarily got the idea for the second movie after someone asked him, "Aren't you worried that your first movie is going to cause copycat killers?" Copycat killings are not new, and it is something that we do see. We've seen people who get obsessed with nonfiction things they read or watch, and they become so obsessed with it that they want to just basically reenact it themselves. And that's what someone was asking Tom Six about, just because the Human Centipede is such a bizarre idea, but it's something that someone who is sick enough could potentially want to do. And Tom Six, after kind of hearing about this, was like, I want to see what that person would be like. So he wanted to explore the realm of someone who would watch the first movie and want to reenact it. So the second movie is sort of more of like an art piece than I would say it is a story being told, mainly because the first film had very Nazi overtones. It was a kind of like a statement on the war and the different experiments that would happen. There were experiments that happened that were just as bad, if not worse, than the human centipede. That happened in real life that you can look up. So these sort of experiments have happened, and crazy shit has happened behind closed doors and just throughout history, and Tom wanted to sort of shine a light on that. So the first movie has that sort of historic background to it that the second movie doesn't. The second movie feels more like an art piece, and it feels even more like an art piece because it's shot completely in black and white, which Tom made that decision in post-production because he watched it in black and white and decided it was much scarier than it was in color. But the creative decisions made in the second Human Centipede is what I think pushes it over the edge of being just more disturbing and creepy than the first one. I don't want to get into too many of like the nitty-gritty details because just based on other people I've watched, apparently YouTube does not like being talking about stuff like this that happens in these movies, which doesn't surprise me because it's like horribly inappropriate and disgusting. But just like as a gist of the first movie, it's about a German scientist who captures tourists and sews them together, anus to mouth. In the first movie, there's only 3, and it's almost like he knows the creature isn't going to survive. He just wanted to prove that he himself could sew 3 humans together in this fashion and they would survive, and he keeps them in a dog cage. He tries to like train the centipede, and it's just awful how he treats these people, and it's disgusting seeing it happen. And you know, he's feeding the person in the front of the train, and he has to defecate into the second person's mouth, and then she has to eat that and defecate into the third person's mouth, and it's a whole big thing, which the first movie is disturbing in of itself. But the second movie brings it up a notch with the obsession and sexual content. The second movie is about a guy named Martin who has a lot of medical issues. He is mentally challenged. He lives with his mother. He's abused by his mother. He was abused by his father. He's abused by his therapist. And he has this unnatural, unhealthy obsession with the first Human Centipede movie. He has a full scrapbook with images from the movie, along with diagrams and drawings of how to create a real human centipede. He also chooses to masturbate to some of the scenes in the first Human Centipede, doing so with sandpaper, by the way. But basically, we see a glimpse into his life as he's controlled by his mother, assaulted by his father, which his father was put into prison for assaulting him, and his mother blames Martin instead of the dad, and his therapist like keeps him drugged up so he can sexually abuse him. Like, you do feel this like sense of dread over Martin's character because you can just see all of these negative things happening to him, and you know it's building up and going to cause him to do something horrible. And that's exactly what he does. His obsession with the human centipede and his just disdain for everyone in his life causes him to basically snap, and he tries to act out this fantasy that he's been scrapbooking about. And after his mother finds the scrapbook in his house and starts to destroy it, disgusted with him, he ends up killing her and basically just starts on this rampage, kidnapping people. He works in a parking garage, so he's able to sort of just pick people off as they come back to their cars late at night. And he even convinces Ashlyn Yenny, who is the girl who plays Jenny in the first movie, the only person who survives in the first movie. He acts like he is Quentin Tarantino's like casting agent and convinces her to come to his warehouse for like an acting role. And she shows up and he kidnaps her and makes her the front of his human centipede train. So we're kind of playing off of that obsession with the movie and even with the actresses within the movie. I guess he decided that his human centipede had to include her. But the movie is just so unbelievably disturbing in some places. He like wraps barbed wire around his genitalia and uses that to have sexual relations with the girl at the end of the train in the human centipede. And Martin obviously does not have the scientific or medical skills to create a human centipede. He literally just staples and duct tapes these people together. And you can even see the realization start to dawn on Martin as people start to sort of die off and just become so sick and they like are pulling themselves off of each other. He gets this like overwhelming feeling of just being in over his head, and he starts to just kind of lose it. And you almost like feel bad for his character, which makes you as the viewer feel weird because you know he's the one that's doing all this horrible stuff, but watching him like his plan just kind of crumble around him and him start to panic, it makes like you panic because now the person who's supposed to be in control is out of control and these people are not going to survive. Martin even just starts to like experiment on them, and as he like grows more and more frustrated, he gets more and more violent. He rips Ashlyn's tongue out because she won't stop screaming, and then like he injects them a bunch with laxatives because everyone's refusing to eat and defecate into the other person's mouth. So he injects all of the centipede with laxatives, and then they're all like explosively defecating into each other's mouths, which is making the person receiving, they bring it back out, and that starts to happen. And Martin at first is like hysterically laughing, and then he starts to vomit excessively. Oh, and if I haven't mentioned it by now, the Human Centipede 2 consists of 12 people. Not just 3. And he's like definitely losing control over his centipede. One of the people he had kidnapped is pregnant, and she actually ends up being able to escape because he assumed that she was dead and had put her off to the side, but she wasn't. And when she comes back into consciousness, she like runs out and gives birth into someone's car, but then like in her panicked, frantic state of trying to get out, it crushes her newborn baby's head under the pedal as she drives away. It doesn't get better. Like there's no point in this movie that feels like it's going to get better because it just doesn't. And the movie doesn't even end with like a triumph of the Human Centipede people being able to overtake Martin. We're kind of just left to assume that he kills everybody off and then just goes back to his normal life. The movie ends with him just sort of watching the Human Centipede, and he seems just as equally excited about it as he was in the beginning of the movie, and that's really it. So it's like you don't even know if he like learned his lesson in the end. But I think it's that ending that really made people feel like this movie didn't need to exist, because there was no even like revelation or resolution at the end for Martin's character. It was just he did something terribly awful and horrible and then gets to continue to live his life and potentially do more awful, horrible things. I can definitely understand why the second movie was so much more atrocious for people than the first one, because honestly, I would agree. The second one I think about way more than the first one. The second one was just horribly creepy, and it's even worse because of how it was done. Like I said, the movie was shot in black and white, which was a post-production decision. It was shot in color, but they chose to make it black and white at the end. But it was also shot with like quick cuts and harsh editing along with limited dialogue. And all of that was on purpose because Tom Six wanted it to be a stark difference between this movie and the first one. The way the first movie was shot was supposed to sort of complement The Doctor, and while it wasn't superly overproduced or overdone with like the lighting and the camera work, it was shot in a way that was sophisticated and that made sense for the movie. It was very sterile feeling in some cases, especially whenever they were in like the surgery room. You felt like you were watching sort of like a sterile video. Tom Six was very careful about how he shot all 3 of the movies. Really had a certain style that he wanted to be able to not only differentiate the 3 movies, but to also be able to give a sort of feeling and evoke an emotion whenever you watch these films. The first one is very clean in the way that it's shot. The coloring is just very nice, and a lot of coloring is done in post-production as well, especially on the bodies of those in the centipedes to sort of give their skin tones different colors. So the first movie relies heavily on coloration and lighting in the film. The second movie, being done in black and white, has a lot harsher cuts and editing, and Tom said this is because in the second movie it's more like an amateur trying to recreate what happened in the first. The first was done by a legit scientist who knew what he was doing and was able to perform the surgery successfully, while the second movie was done by someone who's just obsessed and was doing the surgery in like the worst way possible. And so he wanted this movie to feel almost like if someone did this and recorded themselves doing it. Had that sort of like jittery camera work, quick cuts, rough editing, just grainy, just weird textures throughout. And he definitely gives you that feeling. The movie feels like it's shot purposefully, which I commend it for that, because that I think adds to the experience overall. And then the third movie, which I'm not going to get too much into in this video, it is shot more like overproduced Hollywood style, and that's mainly because it's sort of like a comedy in some ways. It also goes off the first and second movies, but it's considered definitely less violent and graphic. I mean, you see stuff still, and it's still Human Centipede, and it's like the longest Human Centipede ever, but It's definitely not on the same realm as the first two, so we're just kind of not going to talk about that right now. But really, I think the second movie is the scariest, mainly just because of how, I don't want to say real it could be, because I don't think there's ever going to be a person who's going to successfully be able to kidnap 12 people and staple them together like that. But I'm going to say real in the sense of there are people out there who so heavily obsess over these horror movies and things that they read and see and watch and just art that they consume, that they sort of forget that it's not meant to be taken literally. It's more meant to be taken as art. It's an art form. It's an expression of creativity. And sometimes people can take that and just do awful, awful things with it. And that's why this movie, I think, is so more disturbing. I get that the graphic content and what happens in the movie is disturbing, but honestly, I feel like the situation is really disturbing, and it's not something people talk about enough, because the thought of someone actually being so obsessed with the Human Centipede movie that they took actions into their own hands and created their own Human Centipede is horrifying. And you even get that sense of like dread and just build up as the character starts to realize that he's not able to complete this in the right way. People are dying, things are going out of control. He panics and is like grunting and moaning and crying. Martin throughout the whole film does not speak, he only makes noises, and that adds to that sort of like disorienting dread that you get as the viewer, because you don't even really get to hear what's going on in his head. It's just he's panicking, he's going through these emotions and processing what he's doing, and we don't even get to hear any of what he thinks. It's just based solely on what we're watching. So like the Human Centipede isn't necessarily like a classic movie. There are people who do love body horror. There's, you know, torture porn is a thing, where movies like the Saw movies where people just are getting horribly disfigured and deformed and tortured in just terrible, terrible ways. And there are people who like that style of horror. Things like that can get a little much for me, and not in the sense of like I can't stomach watching it. It's more like I get it. Torture porn and body horror is definitely a genre that's like once you've seen it, you sort of get it. And I think that's where a lot of people are with movies like The Human Centipede. Once you've watched it, you don't really need to watch it again. Like you get it. It really has to be like, I love this movie to be the kind of thing you want to watch over and over again. Because honestly, after a while, it's just like, this is just gross. Like, just for the sake of being gross. And with that being said, I'm definitely not, like, in love with either of these movies. I wouldn't say that they're any of my favorites, but I will say that they are good horror movies because they're successful in what they do. There are terrible reviews for these movies. All of them are ranked pretty low. And I think it's because people find it hard to get past the grossness of sewing someone anus to mouth, and then feeding them and all of the things that happen. That what happens in the movie is disgusting and gross, yes, and it's disgusting and gross most likely for the sake of being disgusting and gross. But just because people don't like what they're being shown on screen doesn't mean that the movie itself is bad. It just means that the movie's not made for everybody. Definitely these movies are the kind that are not made to be viewed by the average horror fan. You do have to just like really be prepped for it. It's the kind of movies that come with warnings, and they're not even the worst body horror movies you'll see. There are way, way worse things out there. But it's interesting that this is kind of the movie that hit the mainstream and is a movie that even people who aren't horror fans may have seen just because of the hype behind it. It's sort of one of those movies that's like, you won't believe it until you've seen it. I personally have not watched the third one. It is considered like a comedy horror. It's basically about a prison that implements the ideas of the Human Centipede into their inmates to help just stop with like the violence and disobedience of the inmates. And in that movie, no one's punished for sewing all the inmates together. They're like, this is a great solution to this prison problem. And it honestly doesn't look like a terrible movie, but it's, again, once you've seen a Human Centipede, you've seen them all, sort of, and so it's not one that I'm like inclined to watch. I probably will watch it eventually, but I think the shock value sort of dies off by the third movie, and that's why Tom Six chose more like a comedic approach, because he knows that like the Human Centipede, you can only make so many of those movies before it's, I get it, okay, like I get it. So I'm not going to recommend these movies for you guys to watch, because it's definitely something that you have to decide for yourself if it's something that you want to watch. I don't get grossed out too much by like gore and stuff like that. These movies were gross, but I didn't find them so disgusting that like I couldn't make it through, and I didn't find it so disgusting that like I probably could eat a meal while I watched it, but it's also just, you don't see a lot of it happening, and even in the second movie, what you do see, it's in black and white, so it's like, if you're triggered by like the gory redness of blood, like you don't really have to worry about that. It's more of the actions in the second movie that are disturbing versus what you're watching, mainly because there's just so many horrible sexual content and abuse in this movie. So if stuff like that bothers you, maybe stay away from the second one. But yeah, these are definitely movies that are not popular in the horror scene. But I wanted to give them a little bit of credit because, yes, it's not a popular thing, but I think a lot of what I reviewed was mainly because people were just like, this is a disgusting idea. I can't believe he thought of something like this. And yeah, it's gross. But that's like the point, isn't it? There has to be someone who tries something new, and while the human centipede is disgusting and gross and would be awful to do in real life, I think it's kind of a cool idea. I agree with Tom Six. It's a cool idea for a horror movie, and I think he did it well. Even though they weren't super popular movies, I commend him for doing what he wanted to do and showing sort of an interesting story throughout these 3 movies. And in case you were wondering, I did look it up, and technically it is medically possible. You can technically sew people's mouths to people's butts, but according to doctors, only the first person would really be receiving any nutrients, considering the fact that when you have a movement, that's all of the stuff that's not nutritionally valuable to your body being expended. So the person receiving what the other person's sending out is not going to have any nutrients in it because their body's already taken all of the nutrients. So technically, the only person in the chain who would be getting actual nutrition would be the first person. The other 2 would have to be put on IV drips in order to survive, which we see that happen in the first movie. The centipede is put on IV drips, but even that, it wouldn't be like a consistent thing, and the centipede most likely would not be able to live for like years. It would just be like a short period of time before the people in the second and third part of the centipede would be so malnourished and sick. And the human body has stuff inside of it that reacts poorly when you ingest feces, and infections would happen like instantly, and most likely the second and third part of the centipede would pass away because of infections, and it likely just would not be a sustainable thing. But also in the first movie, he doesn't do it to try to create something that's going to live forever. He does it mainly because he wants to challenge himself and prove that he can. So in case you were wondering, there's the logistics of a human centipede. But yeah, if you guys have seen these movies, I would love to know what you guys think. If you think it's something that was just disgusting and over the top, or if you can see and understand and appreciate the story behind it. I know it's hard. It's very hard to do because these movies are so gross. But if there's something in there that I feel like is just something that you don't get very often with horror, especially mainstream horror. But I'd love to hear what you guys think. You can leave a comment down below or head over to my Instagram, What a Horror. I'll be making a post about this video as well. But as always, I want to thank you guys so much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you want to see more videos. Currently, I'm putting out videos every other Friday, but usually I do every Friday. So yeah, if you guys want to watch more, go ahead and subscribe. But until next time, stay spooky.